everybody. This is Stephanie Ruper. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Naked Humanity podcast, where we take a deep dive into what it means to be human in the modern world. Today is episode number 54X, and I am responding to a listener question about intersectionality. Okay, I am so excited to dig into this. And also, I believe the release of this episode is coinciding with an episode that came out last week with Hannah McGregor about feminism and the like. And so hopefully this will be really coherent with that and the kinds of things that everybody is thinking about these days. And of course, the idea of intersectionality is very important. The language of it is very emotionally provocative for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons on the right and the left and in between. And so I would like to do a little bit of explaining and an unpacking and then reflecting on it. I do want to say at the outset that there is a lot of nuance here, and I attempt to explain a lot and provide some reflections. And so please don't leap to some conclusions, which is very, very easy to do. And I'll demonstrate what I mean by that in my next episode, which will, I think, be really cool. In that one, I'm going to talk about how easy it is to see people as different from you. Anyway, so I want to jump right into the question that has brought us here today. It's from somebody who calls themselves Soy Boy. Soy Boy writes in and says, Stephanie, I have recently discovered your channel and love your content. I would say that we are polar opposites, but at least you seem open to debate. I have left many comments on some of your videos. I am an old school socialist who is shocked by the rise of neo-Marxism and its intersectional dogma. I use the word dogma because it has become a secular religion. I am vegan and I am opposed to the intersectional feminist takeover of the animal rights movement in my local area. Can you discuss intersectionality in a podcast? Please try not to use the word, quote, problematic. Trigger warning, that was a joke. So this is very interesting to me, and I think points to something that we all need to pay attention to, which is that intersectionality as an idea and feminism as an idea or any kind of progressive idea as an idea is often represented in many different ways. And some of these ways, I think, are very nuanced and important to pay attention to. And some of them are less nuanced. And they're unfortunately the ones that we encounter more often than not in media, and in media that is opposed to these ideas. You know, quick aside, as somebody who works in academia and also has worked as like a quote unquote internet personality or an influencer in the health and fitness space, I just want to say that all of the pundits that you listen to have to have an audience in order to have a career, myself included. And that often involves defining yourself in ways that are simple and easy to grasp. And also, of course, arousing emotions and passion in your audience, which means being angry. And it's easy to pick up anger from pundits. And I mean this on all sides of the spectrum. And it's something that is really important to pay attention to. And as a matter of fact, I have a very discerning radar for this sort of thing and do everything I can to try to consume from sources that are taking some degree of objective distance. Sorry about that. So, and I'm saying this because we see so much pushback against ideas about intersectionality and the push for intersectionality that can be very emotionally charged. And that sort of rhetoric, that sort of discourse, those sorts of feelings when we encounter ideas immediately incite feelings in us. And so, again, what I'm trying to do is take a step back and talk about some larger pictures. And so as some examples of the kind of really emotionally charged language you can find on these ideas. I pulled some quotes from people who identify with the right. One is a man named Andrew Sullivan. He says that intersectionality, and I quote, posits a classic orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained and through which all speech must be filtered. Its version of original sin is the power of some identity groups over others. To overcome the sin, you need first to confess, i.e., quote, check your privilege, and subsequently live your life and order your thoughts in a way that keeps the sin at bay. And then a famous YouTuber and now other platform, or Ben Shapiro, describes it similarly. He says, intersectionality is a form of identity politics in which the value of your opinion depends on how many victim groups you belong to. At the bottom of the totem pole is the person everybody loves to hate, the straight white male. So we can understand, I think, that when you first encounter the idea of identity politics, why you might have a defensive reaction if you don't belong to a group that is asking for attention or to which attention is being asked to go. And this kind of language we encounter very easily on the right, and can be very easy for us to then also get really angry, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, let's not be in this like victim blaming whatever. I will, however, say that there are some grains of truth to what they're saying here, based on what you encounter in social media, based on cancel culture, based on many things that I've encountered in my own personal progressive circles of people being somewhat actually having this kind of victim elevating culture, or competing to see who has the worst situation, that sort of thing. Like, that's real and that's human. And we need to sort of make space for that and understand that that can happen on the left, and these kinds of reactions to it can happen on the right. But still, neither of those things, neither of these problematic reactions is really gets to the heart of intersectionality itself and why we should be paying attention to it. So I think when we talk about intersectionality, we need to refer back to its original context. So the word intersectionality, not necessarily a concept which was coming along in various fields and various aspects of Western culture for many decades, but the word of intersectionality, which sort of crystallized it all, was coined in 1989 by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman, a lawyer, in talking about the law. Now, this is hugely important to understand. There are categories in the law that have historically and are currently used to marginalize certain groups, right? Slavery was once legal. That is a radical marginalization of a certain group. And segregation, legal, right? Legally enforced. And women didn't have the right to vote until 100 years ago this year. And so there are categories in law based on race, ethnicity, age, sex, gender that do impact the ways in which people's lives are able to unfold. And this is injustice at its finest, right? So um, I want to give some examples. So here was a legal case that was important. We did actually talk about another legal case in the podcast with Hannah McGregor, number 53. So go check that out if you're interested in this. I'll talk about a different legal case. In a case called DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors, there were 5 Black women who sued General Motors for a seniority policy that was discriminatory against them. So what happened was the company did not hire Black women before 1964, right? The civil rights movement. Black women as a category were not hired until 1964. So there were seniority-based layoffs in the 1970s with the oil crisis and all of that. And when this happened, the earliest hired employees were laid off, and all the older white men got to stay, and the Black women who hadn't been there for a long time were all let go. And so that kind of policy, right, based on changes in law that have happened throughout our country's history, actively makes it harder for Black people to recover from the really, really hard circumstances out of which this entire culture and group of people have been trying to build lives, for the last 170 years or what have you, and obviously before that. So that's one instance in which the legal category of Black women is incredibly important. Now, there are other ways that are related to law, but we also need to think about their impact and how we think about each other in broader culture. There was a wonderful article in Pathos a few months ago that was very revelatory for me, and I'll share the link in the show notes. And it was about how white feminists misunderstand the need of Black feminists. So a couple of examples for there. One thing we have to understand is that Black women have different rights about, or different interests about work, generally speaking, in childcare, right? So white women are often fighting for the right to work because they have been put in the home with the father figure, raising the kids at home. White women fight for the right to work. That's important. Black women have often fought for the right to raise their children, right? In part because there have been forced sterilizations of Black women throughout American history, initiated by slavery, and to this day continues to be a problem in prisons, forced sterilizations. Black women have also been forced to work as single mothers because of the high incarceration rates of Black men, which are in large part, these rates are so high because we, police officers, everybody have a subconscious bias against Black people, and often use these policies as ways, subconscious or not, to penalize Black communities. So that's really important. Another thing that's really important, for example, just the way that we see white women and Black women is different based on race. Black women are often objectified and sexualized in a different sense, in sometimes a more violent sense, or maybe a more animalistic sense, because of this history of language around animality and Blackness, right? And that's something very worth paying attention to. So it is a real thing based off of legal categories and based off of our interactions within this political legal system, right? That these categories do matter. They do impact your life. Now, as to what we should be doing about them, the answer is not abundantly obvious. Right. There are many different approaches, even on the, in progressive circles, in terms of what needs to be done legally, what needs to be done socially, socioculturally, in order to rectify these problems. Obviously, the legal discrimination needs to be done away with, but how and what sort of policies need to be enacted, that's a topic up for debate. But I think it is unquestionable that we need to understand the ways in which these kinds of legal and perceivable categories have impacted our cultures. And yes, white men have tended to be immune to these kinds of cultures, or to these kinds of discriminatory practices, because they have been the ones writing the laws for hundreds, thousands of years. Now, of course, that doesn't mean white men are evil. That doesn't mean that they're bad. That doesn't mean that they necessarily need power taken away from them. And this is often a misperception on the right, that people are trying to take power away from white men. That's not necessarily the case, but power needs to be shared, and others need to be elevated, right? And so this is a very important, misperception that needs to be addressed. So intersectionality began as a legal category 30 years ago now. And it took 30 years to become really, a really popular sociocultural idea, but now it's everywhere. And we need to pay attention to it. I do have some critical reflections on the whole concept and how it's enacted. First and foremost, the law really, really matters. It's important that we change these laws. It's important that we think about policy and culture and how we want to address these problems that are holding people back. And we also need to think about how these categories have permeated our subconsciousnesses, have permeated our lives, have permeated our language, and are influencing us subconsciously. Something I think that people often misunderstand about things like racism and sexism is that, so much of the racism and sexism that exists in the world is not intentional, right? It's subconscious, and we can't necessarily be blamed for that, and nobody should be blaming you for that. I don't think that's a helpful way, a productive way to overcome these things. But we all need to work on understanding and deconstructing these subconscious biases that we have and that are alive in our culture. I think it's also important to understand for people on the right that, and people on the left, that often in progressive circles, at the heart of intersectionality is a desire to see beyond strict black and white lines, right? You often look at intersectionality and see categories and how they intersect, right? Black, white, Latino, color of some sort, gender of some sort, sex of some sort, all these different things. We see these as categories intersecting, and they seem to be reducing us or putting people into these boxes into which they don't necessarily fit, or through which we generalize. But rather than there being like 20 categories, we need to understand that there are actually infinite, near infinite experiences. And these categories are rough guidelines, right? We need to think about them in terms of rough guidelines, and also to not make assumptions about people necessarily based on their belonging to a particular group. I think it's very important. Another point, I don't know what point I'm on now, 3, 4, 5. Another point is that it's really important not to reduce people to categories to which they belong. I spoke with a man on this podcast, episode number 28. I believe it was called Individualism versus Identity Politics, Amod Lele, and he talked about many different things, origins of individuality in Western culture, and also how he felt that identity politics, that being identified with the color of his skin, really made him feel like less of a person. And there's a way in which identity politics and intersectionality can be enacted so as to take, to strip you of your will and your self-identification, and reduces you to these categories. I know plenty of people who feel bound by them. Now, of course, some people really love being able to identify with a group, and they say, yes, that really resonates with my experience. But it's also very important to understand that identity politics, if seen in this very, black-white, absolutist way, can be really confining in terms of how people seek to be individuals, which is really, really important. Which brings me to another point, which is that we all need to be very, very careful that we do not render our identities our religions. The person who wrote into this question, Soy Boy, talked about how identity politics and intersectionality has become a kind of secular religion. I don't think he's wrong. I think that we all need orienting narratives in our lives. And for the vast majority of human history, our orienting narratives came from religion. And now a lot of religious narratives have declined, and we are looking for other options. And shopping and consumerism is one that is widely available to us. And that's why people, are so obsessed with finding the clothing that fits them right and expresses themselves appropriately. And it is easy for identity politics and identifying yourself with a group to sort of fill these functions of giving you a personal narrative and helping you feel a part of this unfolding of the political discourse. And it can be really inimical. People do take it to really extreme lengths. Now, the right, conservatives are correct, I think, in their diagnosis of how this can function. Intersectionality and identity politics can function as a religion, but they have all their own victimhood stuff as well. So nobody is immune to this. But we need to be very, very cognizant of this, because we want to use ideas like intersectionality to take care of one another, but we do not want to use them to alienate people who don't understand or are outside the discourse, right? You don't want to use them to paint people into boxes and rigidly identify with X group or Y group or what have you. Sure, yeah, we all enjoy or suffer at the hands of being identified with various groups, but we must not draw these boundaries too firmly, or else we will really end up, I think, in a war of competing for resources, for what have you. So those are all very important things. I also want to elevate one more concern, which is actually something, it's an idea that I encountered in Jordan Peterson, who's not particularly popular in circles that I run in, but I also personally don't hate him. And I don't think he's as horrible as a lot of people paint him to be. But one idea that I did encounter in his works, regardless of my or anybody's opinions about him, that I think is worth paying attention to, is that we must understand that differences in ability and opportunities exist and will continue to exist forever across our culture. Right? We have these legal categories that we must pay attention to, right? And we have ways in which race and ethnicity and sex and gender and age do influence the ways, the opportunities that are available to people. But what Peterson says is, look, we also need to understand that based on your attractiveness, here are a bunch of questions that impact your life, but you have no control over, right? Like, how good was your mother's nutrition while you're in the womb, right? What are your genes like? How stable was your home growing up? Like, all of these factors are out of your control, and they radically impact the ways in which the opportunities that are available to you and the ways in which you can walk in the world, right? How much money do you have growing up, right? Privilege is so multifaceted, it's everywhere. And getting rid of it in that sense is possibly impossible. And we have this sort of drive, this movement to eradicate, these political differences or lack of access to resources. And again, the law, like, radically, of course, needs to change. And we need to be supporting people with proactive policies. But we have to be very careful that mindful of how all of these different facets play a role and decide what we want to do about them, right? And we need to understand that all of these different categories, these intersections, these black, white, male, female, what have you, are not the only factors at play that determine how somebody's life goes. And that's very, very important. And I'm not saying we should do nothing about any of them. I think we should be doing a lot of things about many of them. But we need to be mindful that intersectionality and identity politics does have its limitations, right? And that's why Kimberly Crenshaw, when she invented the term, grounded it in very real political realities, right? Intangible realities that we can address. And I think that's an excellent starting point. And then, of course, we do need to always be working on the ways in which we think about these categories and mindful about everything else as well. So that was a lot of stuff about intersectionality. I'd be interested to hear what you think. I have gotten some feedback from people who listen to the podcast that they find it valuable when I attempt to describe phenomena in our world that can be very politically charged from a more historical or sociological or objective standpoint, right? I'm here to tell you what I think, what intersectionality is, things about the way that it is changed between certain discourses, right, when we're talking about it in academic papers or law or in the 1980s versus how it's being talked about now, right? I think what we really need is to understand a lot of context and to look beneath what I showed at the beginning of this podcast, were like these highly emotionally charged ideas. Now, of course, anger can be very, can serve us very well. But I think having more comprehensive understandings of where people are coming from can help us better adjudicate, what exactly it is that we want to do moving forward. So I need to get going. This has been longer than intended. We have a winner, of course, for the drawing of this podcast. Her name is Linda. I have emailed her. She's getting a lovely book. If you want to submit a question to this podcast, please do. You can send me a DM on Instagram at Stephanie Ruper, or you can go to stephanieruper.com/form and submit a question anonymously there. If you have any questions, of course, do always get at me. I am so happy to interact with the audience. And I am, of course, always grateful for reviews. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being on this intellectually exciting journey with me. I am Stephanie Ruper, and this is Naked Humanity. It was episode number 54X. Thanks again and take care. I will talk to you next week.